I am Sonakshi Gandhi. I'm a clinical psychologist and I work at a clinic called the Mind Garden. So that's about me. I have been practicing for the last 7 years in the field of clinical psychology. And I have my own private practice, which is in South Delhi. The topic that we're going to talk about today is called Parental Alienation and Child Mental Health. It is a topic that we may have heard maybe sometimes, read about, seen in our family, in our friends, in our relatives, when there is a couple that goes through child custody, through separation or divorce. What really happens there? What is the impact on the child's mental and physical health? And what does parental alienation really mean? So basically what we're going to do today is through the webinar, the 35 odd minutes in the webinar, I'm going to try and talk about parental alienation, also parental alienation syndrome. How are they different? What they mean? We will talk about some examples. I will also try and give you a case study to help you understand how this plays out in actual terms. We will also talk about signs. So how do you really identify alienating parent or a child who feels alienated? As well as what are the consequences of parental alienation? What is the real impact, both in the short term as well as in the long term, on the child, on their mental and physical health? What are the legal aspects? What are the legal standings of this concept in our courts of law today? As well as what is the psychiatric status today? And we will also talk about prevention and what can one really do if they feel like they are in a position where they are being alienated. So that's what we're going to try and cover. And the last few minutes will be reserved for any queries that you may have. Okay, so we live in the second most populated country in the world. We are a population of 1.3 billion people, which would obviously mean more marriages and which should mean more divorces, just by pure statistics. But that doesn't really happen. So just to give you a statistic, in the US, the divorce rates are over 50%. So the number of marriages that happen, 50% of those end in divorce. Whereas in India, the divorce rate is about 1%. Which means out of every, there was a statistic that I read that out of every 1,000 marriages, very few really break. And one would think that one would assume, why does this happen? It's usually because of the collectivistic culture of the Indian, the culture that we are in. It is very family oriented. There is a lot of emphasis on togetherness and values of cohesion. But it's not really necessarily a positive thing, because people end up staying in unhealthy relationships or abusive marriages due to the stigma that divorce carries, but also a big factor of it is because of the issues and challenges associated with child support or child custody. Child custody is seen as a battle that is extremely challenging and very difficult to decipher and determine. Because of that, there is lesser chances, lesser actual statistics of divorce that is also happening in our country. So, one can move towards, now that we're talking about this concept, let's also move towards understanding what can alienation look like. So I have a case study with me. There was a case that I saw recently of a 34-year-old lady who came to me with complaints regarding her daughter, a 7-year-old daughter. So it seems as if of late, in the last month or so, the daughter had started to develop an extremely hostile relationship with the mother. So there were instances where she expressed hatred towards the mother. wanting to avoid her, not wanting to be with her, wanting to be with her father instead, and generally being very defiant and angry towards the mother. And it was a very perplexing or confusing experience for the mother because she had previously shared a very warm and loving relationship with her child. So for her, it was very tough to understand why this was happening. To give you a background of the case, the couple had recently separated about a few months back, and the child had just come from a visit that she had gone to her father's house for a few days, stayed there, and then come back. And that's when, post that, is when this kind of behavior started to show. So as we kept discussing more and more, we realized that this was actually something that was happening for a long time. And it was what we call as parental alienation. So the child was showing symptoms of what had happened in terms of being alienated. Um, so that's how it really looks like. In more daily life, now if I give you some examples of how it can, how does it manifest in daily life, what it can look like. So when you're, for instance, if a parent says that, say child has bruised, child has had a wound or something, and the parent starts to blame the other parent and says that, jumps to conclusion that maybe it's because of the other parent's negligence, or maybe the other parent has been physically abusive to the child, and that's why the child is bruised. That's one instance. The other instance could be something like keeping secrets from the child, using some sort of code language and purposely keeping the other parent away. This is another example. And a third could be using, maybe just using or blaming financial constraints of the target parent, and saying something like to the child that, you can't go for swimming because your mother or your father has refused to pay for the swimming lessons. So you see how subtle these statements are, but what kind of impact they can have on a child is what we're going to discuss going forward. So this is how it can actually look like in day-to-day terms. So coming to what really is parental alienation. It is a constellation of behaviors that could be conscious or unconscious that evoke disturbances in the previously healthy relationship between a child and their target parent. What's important to note is that previously the relationship should have been warm and healthy. It is focused on the parent and not the child. So alienation is something that the parent does. Alienation syndrome is something that the child faces. So it looks like portraying one's former partner in a relentlessly negative light through comments, blames, false accusations, such that the child becomes indoctrinated, brainwashed, and some researchers even call this intimate terrorism. Like how small children are a part of a cult, they are made to manipulated to believe certain things. That's actually how this happens. So it becomes such that the child unknowingly becomes an ally of the alienating parent, the person who practices alienation, towards hating the target parent. So that's how it really happens. There is one exception here, though, which is important to note. If there is any estrangement, which means any distance in the relationship that has happened because of abuse, some sort of physical, mental, sexual, or emotional abuse that the target parent has done towards the child, or if there is physical or emotional neglect that has also happened, or if there is mental illness that has been diagnosed in the target parent, these are few exceptions to parental alienation. So except for these, if any of these behaviors do happen, it is called parental alienation. Now let's talk about what is parental alienation syndrome. Like I said before, this is shown in the child. It's focused on the child and not the parent. These are distinctive behaviors in children that are the direct consequence of parental alienation. So here, this can be manifested through behaviors such as refusing visits to the target parent, avoiding them, hating them, using bad language towards them, expressing a general hostility towards them. So this is what it really looks like when it is manifested. Now, this term, parental alienation syndrome, was coined by a psychiatrist, a child psychiatrist, Dr. Richard Gardner, in 1985. So it's been in existence for a few decades now. Let's come to trying to understand the nature and features of this sort of alienation. We need to really understand parental alienation as a process and not as an outcome. It's not something that one really does. It's something that happens over time. It's a process-based thing. Also, it isn't so static. It's a dynamic process. So the alienator can become the target parent at any point, because what happens is action and reaction. So if one person is taking an action of alienating, the target parent can feel alienated and then also react back. So it's actually a dynamic thing that keeps going back and forth. The other thing to know is that the severity actually ranges from mild to moderate to severe. So in mild, you may hear comments, unhelpful comments like the ones I mentioned at the start. The more severe ones are actually a complete destruction of the relationship between the child and the targeted parent. Well, I would say that some amount of alienation happens probably through every separation or divorce, because people take time to adjust to this new dynamic that sets in. But the intention is never to harm the child or to purposely keep the child away from the targeted parent. So that's how it really differs from your usual divorce cases. Why is it really important to understand more about parental alienation? Is because a child generally needs a healthy relationship with both parents to thrive. But deliberately destroying the relationship between a child and their target parent leads to a plethora of significant mental health issues for the child, which has devastating impact on their psyche, which means emotional, physical, and mental well-being. All of these are impacted. This is also looked at as a form of abuse. So this is emotional abuse. So more and more research that is being done is calling it a form of severe emotional abuse that the child goes through. Now let's spend some time to understand the signs. How do you really identify if a parent is an alienating parent? What are some of the signs? This is not an exhaustive list, so these are just some of the signs that could manifest, though there are many others. The main ones are as follows. The child is given unnecessary or extra details about why the marriage failed, what are the divorce settlements, so things like what are the financial aspects, what are the court-related aspects, what actually happened between both the parents. Now, the child may be too young to understand all this. They may not have the processing power or capacity to be able to take this. And they're still shared with an agenda of creating hate, creating dislike for the target parent. So they're shared in a manner that is actually has an ulterior motive attached to it. The other thing is that when the child refuses or shows ambivalence or unsurety to go and visit the target parent, this is actively supported. So the child it's almost like the child is being reinforced to not visit the target parent. So that is again done deliberately. Refusing the target parent access to the child's medical, academic records, as well as social commitments. So if the child has a PTM or an annual day or has to go for a party or a doctor's visit, all of these are deliberately concealed from the target parent so that more and more distance develops. In more severe cases, there is false allegations of alcohol use, drug use, and also sexual abuse that the target parent has done towards the child. Another one which I feel is not limited to parental alienation, because it happens in a lot of families that I've seen, is asking the child to choose between both the parents. Now, it may seem like a harmless decision, but for a child, there's a lot of agony that the child actually goes through when they have to choose between two people that they love. So that is also a part of alienation, because that happens in a more severe manner and in a more intense manner. Also, using the child to obtain information or data about the target parent with a motive to use that data later in court cases, in the proceedings of the court, in order to make sure that the child stays with the alienating parent. That's another sign of an alienating parent. So these are some of the main signs that an alienating parent actually shows. So if these signs are then picked up in a child, they start to manifest what we are now going to come to, which is signs in an alienated child. Right? Now, what happens here is that the child starts to manifest an unreasonable and unjustifiable hatred for the target parent. And please note, I'm using the word hatred and not dislike, because the level of intensity of how the child really feels is massive. It's a lot of hate that they feel for the target parent. Um, you also can tell that there is obvious similarity between what the alienating parent says, their narrative, and the narrative of the child. There's a lot of similarity to that. So it's almost like the child is mirroring or parroting what the target parent says. There is a complete refusal to visit the target parent without any reason, without any justification. There is just a complete refusal. The child also exhibits a lack of fear in court proceedings, which is also unlikely because usually children are curious or worried about their surroundings in a place like this, but the child shows no fear there. There is a lack of ambivalence in the child about their thoughts on the parent. They don't have any ambivalence on that. They are very sure that they hate them, and there's no question on that anymore. There's no guilt in the child regarding misbehavior towards the target parent. So they may actually say extremely mean things and maybe even indulge in some sort of physical violence by hitting, slapping, or kicking the target parent without feeling any sense of remorse or guilt for doing so. The hatred also surprisingly moves away from the target parent and actually encompasses their own extended family. So the target parents, siblings, cousins, everybody comes under the same umbrella of hate. Again, this is not an exhaustive list, and this is meant to help you just see, sense what kind of signs there are in an alienated child. So let's come to who really does it and why. What is the reason for this sort of an alienation? Now, the profile, the psychological profile of an alienator or an alienating parent shows one of the two patterns. Both are pathologies in the sense that they are both psychological illnesses. One is called narcissism and the other one is called borderline. So a person who is a narcissist is one who is self-absorbed, somebody who really cannot take the perspectives of other people around. He or she tends to make the child a pawn in their own power game. So they cannot really look beyond their own selves, and they don't have any guilt or remorse for damaging the child. So that's one sort of alienator. The other sort of alienator is somebody who is emotionally very reactive. So they may actually show excessive love to the child when the child takes their side, and show almost hatred towards the child when the child unknowingly takes the other parent's side. So this sort of emotional reaction is really high amongst the borderline kind of alienator. So this is basically the kind of profile that an alienator has. Now, coming to what is the reason behind this? Why does it happen? Why would a parent want to deliberately damage the psyche of their child? What really goes on in their mind? Now, few of the reasons that have been documented are, one is, of course, there is jealousy. If the other parent is moving on in their lives, or getting married, or in a new relationship, or has actually been the person who decided to quit this relationship or marriage and moved forward may not have gone down well with the alienating parent. And that may be one of the reasons why this happens. The second could be wanting to get back at the spouse, again, for some sort of perceived insult, embarrassment, humiliation that the alienating parent may have felt. The third could be wanting to extort money, in the sense that wanting to take money for themselves or for their child, wanting more of that. So maybe that could be another reason. And of course, wanting a pathological need to want the child only and only to oneself. That could be another reason why this happens. Now, when this term was coined in 1985, the psychiatrist who coined this term said that there were gender differences between who does the alienation. But research now has found that there are no real gender differences between who does this alienation. It happens across both genders. But what's common is that the child bears the brunt of it. Though it is seen that gender stereotypes play a huge role in who gets alienated and who is the alienator. So, for instance, when the mother badmouths the father about not really providing for the child financially, that is seen as more acceptable. And if the father badmouths the mother about her being very busy with her career, that may be seen as more acceptable. So, in a sense, gender stereotypes do play a role in who gets alienated and who is the alienator. Let's talk about the consequences of parental alienation. It's becoming clear now that it is being fast recognized as a difficult place to be in, the alienation as well as the alienation syndrome. So children in general are considered to be extremely resilient. They seem to be able to deal with the challenges that life and circumstances provide to them. But they are also impressionable. Their minds are young. So that makes them vulnerable to the sorts of abuse that we are talking about, parental alienation. Because there is irreparable damage that actually happens to the child's psyche, future relationships, self-esteem, mental and emotional growth. So coming to what I've written here is the legally valid argument that has happened. In 2017, Court of India actually gave a judgment regarding where they accepted and acknowledged parental alienation as being a valid legal argument in the court, and gave their judgment according to that. So that was the first time in India that it has been recorded. Though in the other countries, it's been practiced for a long time, for decades that it's been going on. The other thing that I've written here is about ICD-11. So psychiatry has a manual called the International Classification of Diseases, the ICD, that comes up with new versions every few years. So the 11th version of the ICD, which is about to come in 2022, has finally included parental alienation as being a psychiatric problem or a psychiatric issue, which is huge, because then if it's included there, it means that it gets the status that it always deserved. So that's about where we are in terms of the legal and psychiatric status. So let's come to this study that I read, which was extremely interesting, about in 2016. It was again done in the US. So what they did was they essentially a few college students tracked their early lives, their childhoods, and they saw a major link between children who had grown up in a alienated environment and who started to exhibit similar traits in later in life. So essentially, children who had grown up watching their parent alienating the other parent, alienating the child themselves from the other parent, they picked that up and they imbibed it and started to play by the same kind of traits later in their own lives, which again goes to show that the effects or the impact of parental alienation goes way beyond the short-term impact. This is something that stays long-term. The child's innate need of loving and needing to be loved, gets thwarted when they are being alienated. So in a sense, what we need to really understand here is that what the child needs is both parents to thrive. So anything that thwarts that, whether it is the child is anyway getting used to the divorce, is anyway getting used to the loss of one parent, anything that thwarts that is something that will damage the child's psyche later in life. So essentially, there are short and long-term effects on the child of parental alienation, and we'll come to those now. These are the impacts on the child when it comes to parental alienation. These are the short-term impacts. Now, out of these impacts, what is important are two major ones, which I will talk about more in detail. One is called self-hatred, and the other one is called depression. Now, self-hatred, what happens here is that, see, this one is particularly disturbing in children because the child seems to internalize or imbibe the hatred that exists towards the targeted parent. So it's like they have picked that up and put it into themselves. They've internalized it. They are somehow led to believe that the target parent did not want them, did not love them, and that's why they are no more part of their lives. And they may experience massive guilt, enormous guilt for betraying the target parent. So this may be something that manifests through hating their own selves. The other part is depression. Now, this is rooted through feelings of being unloved by one parent. Uh, from separation and being denied an opportunity to be able to mourn the loss of the other parent. Now the child is not even allowed to talk about it or meet the other parent. So it's really a trauma that the child is going through on their own without any sort of support or help. So that these are two main kind of issues that come up in the short term. But let's look at the other ones also in some detail. Loneliness, of course, because now it's only one parent, so the child may feel the loss and loneliness of the other parent being around, considering the roles that the other parent really played for the child. Low self-esteem, that again is a direct consequence of the alienation, of the self-hatred, and of the depression. Now, when a child is going through something emotionally, usually two things get impacted. One is their general way of being, so their academic performance, their relationship with their friends, their extracurricular activities, all of these things will see a dip. They will not feel like talking to others. They will want to, their marks or their grades will reduce, and they will not want to participate in many activities that they were earlier interested in. So these things will start to reduce. The child can also show two different kinds of behaviors. So they can show acting out, which means that they will become increasingly defiant, even with the alienating parent. They will become very angry. They will start lying. They will start being disobedient. Or they may show withdrawn behavior. So they may become depressed or anxious or introvert. So it may move either side. And the biological functions of the child, so their sleep, their appetite, and their general routine may also get disturbed. The child may spend excessive amount of time on gadgets, on video games, on mobile phones and laptops, just as a measure to numb the pain or to distract oneself. So these are the short-term impacts of parental alienation on the child. But of course, we know by now that it doesn't stop here and it moves towards long-term impact as well. Let's have a look at those now. These are the long-term impacts of parental alienation on the child. Now, as we are seeing here, the first thing that is mentioned is the child may pick up a similar pattern in behavior as the alienating parent does. So subconsciously, the child may imbibe and pick up the exact same way that the alienating parent has treated the targeted parent, and use that to project onto his or her own life. So his or her own friendships or relationships, without really knowing that this is where it's coming from. So it may be that, it could go two ways again here. So it could be that the child becomes narcissistic, like what I had described before. And as a result of that, there are no healthy relationships. Or the child may become somebody who's withdrawn and depressed, which means they may again be subjected to abusive relationships. In either case, there will be no healthy relationships that the child will then form. The lack of confidence, which also is a part of the narcissism, but it's just covered up by a layer of self-absorption. And of course, the direct consequence is depression. So there also one can see a lack of confidence that may be there. The child may be excessively guilt-prone because of whatever has happened before. And as an adult also, he may see things the same way. There may be an excessive us versus them sort of thinking. As an adult, the person may view people as good or bad, just really good people and very bad people, no in-betweens, no gray areas. So the capacity to form relationships or function in a society again may be very diminished. There may be substance abuse, there may be alcoholism in the adult individual, there may be body image issues again, depression and anxiety that we had discussed before, and a general stunted quality of life. So the capacity, like I said, to be able to experience life in its fullest form, to be able to be happy and move forward in relationships and career and various aspects of self-growth may actually be stunted because of the long-term impact of parental alienation. Let's come to what can really be done now that we're talking about this. What is it that we can do about parental alienation? Let's look at that now. I think what's most important is to remember here that prevention is always going to be better than cure. So understanding that one needs to co-parent, which means the responsibility actually lies on both parents and not one, to be able to be parents to the child and not confuse that with being spouses to each other. So knowing that you're not husband and wife anymore, but you're still parents to your child, that clarity and that distinction is an important one to make. Also understanding that you and your child can have differing opinions and feelings about various aspects of life. So a child may have a different perspective than you do, and that's completely fine. There's no reason why the child should echo everything that you also feel. So being able to be empowered enough to understand that and actually encourage the child to have a differing opinion is important. Asking yourself this one question that I have written here in quotes, which says, what could I have done that may be leading to this kind of disturbing relationship that my child has with his or her other parent? So you're really looking within to understand if you are any of the reasons, if your behavior is one of the reasons why the child is behaving the way that they are with the other parent. So it's important to look inward here. Seeking help through a trained clinical psychologist, somebody who is understanding enough to know the kind of aspects we're talking about parental alienation, and is trained in the field to be able to help prevent or treat it, as well as looking at the legal system and hiring a good lawyer or attorney who can help you navigate your case better. So this is important. Avoiding knee-jerk reactions. This means that when you've begun to understand that this kind of alienation may be happening to you, you are the target parent and it may be happening to you, it is important not to immediately and impulsively act. So often what we see is that parents, the alienated or the targeted parent reacts with anger, with a lot of emotional reactivity, and often ends up becoming the alienator himself. So like I had discussed with you before, the same sort of cycle replays in an opposite pattern. So the alienator becomes the alienated and vice versa. So it's important not to have that kind of a reaction. Understand that it is part of a process and it is something that's going to require some time before it can be correctly and appropriately intervened into. Uh, not alienating the child in response. So sometimes parents are not able to understand that the fault doesn't lie with the child, and instead end up alienating the child themselves. So they actually end up proving the child right when they start to hit the child of their own. So that is important to remember, that it's not the child's fault that this is happening. Immediately going ahead and filing for custody, change in custody, again, may be something that may backfire. So it is important to take cognizance of the matter, take all the evidence that you need, discuss with professionals in the field, and then approach the court for anything. Um, what one can really work on with the help of therapy is working on repairing the relationship with your child. Understanding, like I said, that it's not the child's fault and the relationship that has been damaged needs repairing. So through therapy, which actually happens when the child and the targeted parent are both called in for therapy together, so that they can get a safe space to discuss their emotional issues with each other. The individual parent, both the alienated and the alienator, both of them have to go in for individual therapy themselves. And through these different modes of counseling and therapy, everybody starts the process of healing. Uh, what one can essentially do is focus on re-experiencing or revisiting past pleasant memories, positive memories of the past that you and your child have shared as a targeted parent. Before you did become the target, you must have shared great memories with your child. There must have been vacations, there must have been outings which would have resulted in some photographs or maybe some mementos. Going back and revisiting them with your child, spending some time on that, will help him or her look at the relationship in a different light. Also, reunification, which is also something that the therapist will help you do, in the sense that reunify the bond between you and your child and repair it. So that's something essentially that you will learn in therapy as you move along that. So, just some thoughts before we end this. These are my thoughts that I felt and I still feel when I see these kind of cases. So, children, like I said earlier, are extremely resilient. They are very, very. They have the capacity to be able to handle life circumstances, challenges that life may throw at them, whether it is some sort of there is a death of a parent, or there is a divorce or separation that happens in the family. Through love, through support, through care, through appropriate explanation, children are able to overcome these difficult circumstances and be able to also thrive without any major psychological scars. Uh, but with parental alienation, what happens is there is repetitive exposure to this sort of abuse, which actually damages the psyche of the child slowly and steadily. So that is actually a very, very degrading form of abuse that happens, that children can't really recover from. The sense that once it starts, it's a process. Uh, hatred is not really a natural emotion that all of us are born with. This is an emotion that is learned. It is acquired. So it is being brainwashed to the child. Children also, tend to have an underdeveloped capacity to be able to process information, to be able to take in what is good for them and to filter out what is bad for them, and to express their emotions and their thoughts clearly. They haven't developed that as well as adults have. They don't have that kind of vocabulary that adults do. So as a result, the younger the child, the more intense the impact of the parental alienation. Um, Also, one may ask, why does the child actually side with the alienating parent? Some bit of it, actually majority of it, is because of a need to survive. You see, the child has already lost one parent through divorce or separation. They don't want to deal with the loss of another parent as well. So they want to. This is like their cry for help. So they are looking to seek help from you. Even when they are exhibiting this, they don't really mean it. That's important to know. So just because this is hidden doesn't mean that it's insignificant. And it should be given the same status, the same importance that a child that has gone through some other form of abuse, say sexual abuse or a war scene or a war crime, that kind of impact is similar to this kind of impact. So it needs to be looked at with the same lens. So I think that's about it. This is what I had to share. I'm free to take in any questions that you may have.